Time for what?
Experience in college.
Time for reinforcement.
Time for liftoff!
Where nothing is impossible unless you think it is impossible.
College.
My college scholarship.
Yes.
Boom.
College ran by real fast.
You hung in with the best college.
First time for everything.
Well, what are you waiting for?
What are you waiting for?
Let's do this thing.
Genius, let's do this thing!
All right, welcome everyone to the show. We are so lucky today to have Drew Riley, who has more than 11 years experience from colleges like Carle College, St. Mary's College of California, Colgate, and now as the Director of Admissions at Denison University in Ohio. Denison is an amazing school because it has notable alums like CEO, presidents, VPs from Disney, Sprint, ESPN, also actors like Steve Carell, Jennifer Gardner, an award-winning journalist, and so much more. His progressive experience in undergraduate admissions at private liberal arts colleges is vast. He has an array of experience from enrollment management to even strategic planning for admissions. He's very familiar of both sides of the desk in college admissions and is a great resource for us. Thank you, Drew, for coming to the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here, and I hope I can live up to that phenomenal introduction.
Oh, well, no, I think it's easy for you because I've heard you present. So no, and visited your campus, which I love. So before we start talking about, to test or not to test with this whole new world that the pandemic has introduced more families and admissions into, let's hear a little bit about this phenomenal school, Denison University.
Yeah, absolutely. So Denison, as you said, we have many phenomenal alumni. We're a small liberal arts and sciences college, and that's my background, like you mentioned. I've always worked at and went to small liberal arts colleges, residential colleges, so that's definitely my passion is for that type of institution, of which Denison is a phenomenal example. Denison is 100% residential, so students live on campus for all 4 years here. We have about 2,300 undergraduate students, and we are located in beautiful Granville, Ohio, which is about 25 minutes from Columbus. So one of our favorite things about Denison is you get that kind of small college residential atmosphere in a small college town in Granville, but with proximity to a major metropolitan area of Columbus, 2.5 million people, largest city in the state of Ohio and the state capital as well. So so we love it here. I've been here at Denison for about 2 years now, and I love every minute of it.
Oh, yeah. One thing I do want to shout out, when I did visit the campus, the thing that really opened my eyes was the interaction with the students and the professors and the smiles on both sides. I mean, I think that's the smiliest campus I've ever been. I've been doing this for over a quarter of a century. So it is great. The other thing is that I still remember is how sore some of my muscles were because there are steps going there, which is great if you want your exercise going to and from class. But it's a beautiful campus, so they're very, very lucky to have you. Now, So today we're talking about because prior to 2020. This would be the time of year where a lot of people are taking out their SAT books and ACT books, studying, looking at averages. And the pandemic made that stop because of gathering in large places. And, but this whole world of test optional has been around for a long time. So what is test optional for our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, there are several components to the entire application. So when we say the admission application, we're really referring to the entire package, everything that a student submits on their behalf in order to give us, as admission officers, a holistic view of them in order to make admission decisions. Now, at many, many colleges and universities, historically, that package has included, at the very least, the application form itself, some sort of essay, high school transcripts, and those components are pretty standard, letters of recommendation, and then test scores from the SAT and the ACT. There's been a path from, if you trace it back to the dawn of these test scores 50, 60 years ago to now, where colleges have required these test scores in really stringent ways, but those have eased up over time, over the last, again, 50 or 60 years. That's really dramatically accelerated probably in the last decade, and then really, really dramatically this year, to where more and more colleges have gone test optional. And this year, because of the pandemic, I would say most colleges in the country, the vast, vast majority have gone test optional, which essentially means that, like other components, testing can be a part of a student's application if they choose to submit it to the college, but it's not actually required. So colleges will have those elements that are still required for the application, but several other elements that are not required. And testing has dropped essentially from that required band to that non-required but optional band of elements that students can incorporate into their application. And what that means essentially is that it's up to students to choose if that's a part of themselves that they want represented in their application. So they didn't have that agency in the past at many different places, but now they do have that agency to decide if a test score they think will lend anything to their application, and help an admission office understand about their admissibility at the college. So it's been a long kind of progression, but we are at a point now where at most colleges in the country, testing is actually an optional element of the application.
Yeah, and there was a lot of families like, no, this isn't true. And the National Association for College Admissions and Counseling, NACAC, asked colleges to say test optional really means test optional and have people do a pledge. So what was some of the language and things that you were hearing from families when they heard, there was this option but didn't believe it?
Yeah, essentially, and this is, it's kind of disappointing, but it's completely understandable. I think that families have been skeptical of colleges going test optional this year, because I think the sense is that many colleges went test optional because they were forced to, because they know that so many students did not have access to testing this year, but it wasn't actually something that those colleges wanted to do, and that students who submitted test scores would have an advantage in the process. And I can tell you from my experience, and I can't speak for every college in the country, but having worked at several different offices, having worked in highly selective places, including Denison, that when we as a college and as an admission office say we are test optional, that we mean that, essentially, that testing truly is optional, and that students who don't submit test scores are not at a disadvantage in the selection process. And so that's what the language that NACAC put forward and that many colleges signed, most colleges that went test optional, especially this year, signed, was saying specifically is that you can trust us as a college when we say that we are test optional. You can trust that that is true, and that you should not put yourself in harm's way or fly to another state or do any of the crazy things that we're hearing about in order to take a test that is optional in the application.
Yeah, no, don't add on the stress that unfortunately even tests were never required. It's there's a lot of anxiety. Don't put yourself through that, especially for the beautiful children. And so a lot of times the question comes out, well, then what are they going to be looking at? And one thing I paused because it was never always about the number, right? That's what holistic is. And how I describe it is simply the pie for everything else gets bigger, right? Mm-hmm. So you spend more, there's more time looking at that. Am I wrong, or is there another secret formula, that's out there? Because the only proof I could tell students, now with the class of 21, I'm look, this kid got into Johns Hopkins with no test score. This kid got into USC with no test scores. It's really happening. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. The truth is that we in the higher education world have known for a long time through lots of study, through longitudinal studies, things like that, validity studies, that testing doesn't tell us a whole lot about a student to begin with. And so I think testing, even though it was still required at a lot of places, it actually started to lose its importance in a holistic selection process over time, because we just learned that it's not an incredibly valuable indicator of a student's potential in college. And so there's some things that have been known about testing for quite a while, which is that, one of them is that testing, essentially, it's less predictive of success in college than it is of family income. And that makes a lot of sense, because if you think that families with higher income have more resources and more time to be able to prepare for those tests, and test preparation actually does yield some results in the actual test scores themselves, then you can see exactly why that would be. That it's supposed to be measuring students' potential ability for academic success in the classroom, but it's really just telling us what kind of resources they have at hand to be able to prepare for these tests. The other thing is that students of color who were equally successful in the classroom in high school and equally successful in the classroom at college still had lower test scores on the ACT and the SAT. And so that inherent bias in the test is really, really well known. And I promise you that every admission office in the country is well aware of that fact. And so the truth is that the tests, I think, were having less and less of an impact in college decisions as these studies took place. And so, finally, it's a test optional component. So what really is predictive? Essentially, grades are the most predictive thing of all. A student's, and it's not just that GPA, it's about individual course performance and course rigor throughout 4 years. And if you ask any high school student what they think is most predictive of their success in college, they're probably going to point to their grades. That's the truth, because they know what it has meant to them to tackle different courses, tackle difficult coursework, to challenge themselves in different areas, right? They know sometimes when they have a really strong strength in certain subject areas, they have to work a lot harder in certain subjects. They know when they've been improving throughout their 4 years and their grades get better and better, even as the difficulty goes up. And that's what we see on transcripts, and that actually has proven to be by far the most predictive element of a student's success in college. So honestly, I don't think that the colleges and universities who are going to see fewer test scores this year, the selection process, I think they're finding, is not as difficult in the absence of those tests as they thought it might be, because the truth is we were leaning on those elements pretty dramatically in the past, and can continue to do so. So the transcript, the letters of recommendation, what your teachers say about you, what kind of student you are in the classroom, what kind of citizen you are at your school, the writing, the essays, right? Telling us your story, telling us about yourself, giving us context to read the rest of the application through. And then those activities as well. We want to know how students spend their time outside of the classroom, especially at a residential college like Denison. We really want to know what kind of person they will be in our community, even outside of the classroom as well. So those elements have always been huge in any holistic application review process. And the truth is that testing has never been highly predictive of a student's success anyway. And so we've got all the tools we need to make accurate decisions from my point of view.
No, I totally agree. And I think one of the thing I'm hearing a lot from the class of 22 is, okay, well, let's just take the test and see what happens. But what still is going on as an outsider that I observe students doing is they're sucking up so much time on prepping for the test. And then when I talk about, so tell me what you do outside of the classroom, right? There's not a lot being discussed about growth, learning, engagement. If they say I have a love for the subject, how have you demonstrate that outside of the classroom? There's a long pause. And then one thing is, the reason why I love being a counselor is I have the privilege of students talking to me and the stress that they have about that number. And they put value as their worth on there. And it's like, is that really, the GPA can't go away. But why add this other thing on there? And, they could have used that quality time in other arenas out there. But there are some families where a kid, especially with COVID-19, had some hiccup moments GPA-wise, right?
Yes.
Their GPA does not really reflect their potential. What would you say to those kids where, hey, I'm not unweighted 3.8, 3.6. I'm actually quite lower. Should I take the test?
Yeah. Well, first, I want to say I'm so glad you brought up the point about sort of the wasted time that goes into test preparation, because that's the predominant thing that I think of when I think about all of the resources that students dedicate to getting a point or 2 points higher on their ACT. or on their SAT is what they could have been doing instead. Reading for pleasure, digging into subjects that they're interested in, even just having fun as teenagers and hanging out with friends and trying new things and going to new places. It's just such a waste of the potential and the time, the limited time we have as teenagers. As you and I know, we'd love to go back and be teenagers again for a few days. And it's just so disappointing. So regarding the question about, GPA, I think that one of the things that we try to do in a holistic application review process is really examine the context